Vladimir Putin's grandest ambition was never merely about security, nor was it truly about NATO expansion. It was an imperial project, pure and simple, a desperate, clawing attempt to reverse the flow of history and resurrect the geopolitical titan that dissolved in 1991. The invasion of Ukraine was drafted as the opening act of this restoration, a thunderous declaration that the bear had returned to the woods, teeth bared. Instead, the world is witnessing something far more profound and catastrophic, the slow-motion disintegration of the Russian Federation itself. What was intended to be a coronation of Russian might has morphed into an autopsy of its systemic rot. The facade of strength, carefully curated over 2 decades of state propaganda, has been stripped away, revealing a foundation that is brittle, hollow, and rapidly fracturing. The irony is Shakespearean in its tragedy. In his obsessive quest to rebuild the Soviet Union, Putin has likely engineered the destruction of the very state he governs. The collapse is no longer theoretical. It is visible, visceral, and accelerating. To understand the trajectory of this disaster, one must look past the current headlines and return to the genesis of Putin's political psyche. The signs of this imperial overreach were not hidden. They were broadcast with chilling clarity from the moment he stepped out of the shadows. Rewind to 1999. Russia was a chaotic, humiliated husk of its former self, reeling from a decade of economic banditry and lost prestige. Into this void stepped a former lieutenant colonel of the KGB, a man whose worldview was forged not in the democratic optimism of the 90s, but in the cold, paranoid corridors of Soviet intelligence. In one of his inaugural addresses to the State Duma as prime minister, Putin did not speak of reform or integration. He spoke of status. Russia has been a great power for centuries and remains so, he declared. It was a statement of defiance, a refusal to accept the reality of Russia's diminished standing. He warned the world that Russia had legitimate zones of interest, and that it would not tolerate being ignored. At the time, Western observers largely dismissed this as domestic posturing, red meat for a bruised electorate. In hindsight, it was a manifesto. Putin has spent his entire tenure trying to bend reality to fit that 1999 vision. He is a leader governing in the present but living entirely in the past, driven by a nostalgic hallucination of a time when Moscow's whisper could topple governments from Warsaw to Kabul. This fixation became undeniable in 2005, during his now infamous address to the Federal Assembly, when he termed the collapse of the Soviet Union the major geopolitical disaster of the century. He wasn't just engaging in historical analysis, he was expressing a personal and national trauma. For Putin, the dissolution of the USSR was not a liberation of captive nations. It was a genuine drama that severed the Russian body politic. He spoke of tens of millions of co-citizens and compatriots finding themselves suddenly abroad, stranded by arbitrary new borders. He described the epidemic of disintegration infecting Russia itself. These words reveal the core of his motivation, a deep-seated revanchism. He does not see the independent nations of the post-Soviet space as sovereign entities. He sees them as wayward provinces, temporary aberrations in a history that inevitably bends back toward Moscow. This rhetoric of compatriots is the key to decoding his foreign policy. It is a dual-edged sword. On one side, it masquerades as concern for ethnic Russians living in the so-called near abroad. It frames Moscow as a protective older brother, watching out for family members stranded in hostile territory. But strip away the sentimental veneer and a darker ambition emerges. By claiming these populations as part of the Russian world, Putin creates a permanent pretext for intervention. If everyone who speaks Russian or remembers the Soviet anthem is part of the family, then the borders of Kazakhstan, Estonia, or Ukraine are merely administrative suggestions, not sovereign red lines. This sentiment was reiterated with startling clarity just months before the tanks rolled toward Kyiv. In the 2021 documentary Russia New History, Putin lamented the loss of what had been built over a millennium, describing the 1991 breakup as a humanitarian tragedy. He shared anecdotes of his own struggles, moonlighting as a taxi driver to survive the economic wreckage of the 90s. It was a rare glimpse of vulnerability, but one weaponized to justify aggression. The humiliation of the past became the fuel for the belligerence of the present. He wasn't just invading Ukraine to seize territory, he was invading to avenge the humiliation of having to drive a taxi in St. Petersburg. For years, this strategy of coercion and influence seemed to hold water. The Kremlin maintained a stranglehold on the post-Soviet space through a complex web of economic dependency, security guarantees, and political puppetry. In Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko remains the archetype of the vassal state leader, a dictator whose survival depends entirely on Putin's favor, turning a sovereign nation into little more than a staging ground for the Russian military. In Central Asia, the dominance was economic and security-based. Nations like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia looked to Moscow as the guarantor of their stability. The logic was simple. Russia was big, Russia was rich, and Russia was the only game in town. But gravity is shifting. The centripetal force that once kept these nations in Moscow's orbit is failing. The disastrous war in Ukraine has shattered the myth of Russian omnipotence, and the satellites are drifting away. Georgia was the canary in the coal mine. Its pivot toward the European Union and NATO was an existential affront to Putin's worldview, triggering the 2008 invasion. Yet, despite the tanks, the Georgian yearning for the West has not been extinguished. It has only been complicated. Moldova follows a similar trajectory. Desperate to break free from the suffocating embrace of the Kremlin, Chisinau has accelerated its integration with Europe. Russia's response has been predictable. Hybrid warfare. The Kremlin has deployed its full arsenal of disruption, funding opposition candidates, orchestrating protests, and flooding the information space with digital poison. But these are the tactics of a spoiler, not a hegemon. They reveal a Russia that can no longer inspire loyalty, only manufacture chaos. And then there is Ukraine. In the lexicon of the Russian elite, it is often dismissively termed Little Russia. But in Putin's strategic calculus, it is the keystone. There is no Russian empire without Ukraine. The cultural, historical, and industrial weight of Kyiv is essential to the project of restoration. The seizure of Crimea in 2014 was the opening move, a quick surgical strike that intoxicated the Kremlin with false confidence. They mistook the disorganized response of the West and the chaotic state of the Ukrainian military for a permanent reality. When Putin ordered the full-scale invasion in 2022, he wasn't attacking a foreign country. In his mind, he was correcting a clerical error of history. His assertion that Russians and Ukrainians are one people is not a call for unity. It is a denial of Ukrainian existence. It is a declaration that Ukrainian identity is a fabrication, a virus introduced by Western meddling to divide the Slavic soul. But the narrative of liberation was dead on arrival. The invasion was never about saving Russian speakers from mythical fascists. It was a war of conquest, plain and simple, a violent attempt to drag the little brother back into the basement before he could escape to the West. The failure of this enterprise has been total. Manlio Graziano, a geopolitical analyst at Sciences Po, dismantles the Kremlin's logic with surgical precision. He notes that Russia isn't claiming rights over Ukraine based on modern political realities. They are claiming the right to rebuild the Russian Empire. This plan didn't begin in 2022. It began the moment the Soviet Union fell. The creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States in 1991 was viewed by Moscow not as a divorce settlement, but as a placeholder for a future reunion. Putin's grand strategy required the subjugation of the Slavic core, Belarus and Ukraine, before expanding outward. If Kiev had fallen in 3 days as planned, the momentum would have been terrifying. The Kremlin would have claimed a mandate to reorder the entire post-Soviet space, turning its gaze toward the Caucasus and Central Asia with renewed menace. Instead, the Russian military has driven itself into a meat grinder. The reputational damage is irreversible. Russia is not just failing to win, it is exposing itself as structurally incompetent. Graziano draws a brutal comparison. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted 6 months and changed the course of World War II. The battle for Pokrovsk has dragged on for 18 months with no decisive result. The fact that the Russian war machine managed to capture only a minuscule fraction of additional territory throughout 2025 is not a stalemate. It is a defeat in slow motion. The invasion has achieved the exact opposite of its intended goals. Instead of projecting strength, it has broadcast weakness. The Second Army of the World has been fought to a standstill by a smaller, determined nation armed with Western surplus and existential grit. The former Soviet republics are watching, and they are taking notes. The fear that once kept them in line is evaporating. The collapse is not limited to the battlefield, it is hollowing out the Russian interior. Before the first tank crossed the border, the Russian economy was a fortress, unremarkable in its diversity but robust in its reserves. It was built on the bedrock of hydrocarbons, a petrostate with a healthy sovereign wealth fund and deep integration into global markets. Today, that fortress is under siege. While official GDP figures suggest growth, roughly 3.6% in 2023 and 3.8% in 2024, these numbers are a mirage masked by military spending. This is not organic economic health. It is the feverish activity of a war economy cannibalizing its own future. The state is pumping trillions of rubles into the defense sector, manufacturing tanks that are blown up weeks later. It adds to GDP on paper, but it produces no wealth, no innovation, and no improvement in the standard of living. Under the surface, the rot is spreading. Western sanctions have severed Russia's arteries to the global financial system. The banking sector is isolated. Supply chains are broken. The national wealth fund is being drained to plug budget deficits. The civilian economy is being starved of labor and capital as the military-industrial complex devours everything in sight. Inflation is gnawing at the savings of ordinary Russians. The ruble is volatile. The oligarchs, once the kings of London and the Riviera, have seen their assets frozen and their horizons shrunk to the borders of the Federation. But the pain is most acute for the average citizen who faces rising prices for food, fuel, and housing. The energy weapon, once Putin's trump card, has misfired. For decades, Europe's addiction to Russian gas was Moscow's geopolitical insurance policy. That leverage is gone. Europe has pivoted with surprising speed, finding alternative suppliers. Russian exporters are now forced to sell their oil at discounted rates to China and India, transforming Russia from a partner into a junior resource colony for Beijing. Ukraine's asymmetric strikes on Russian oil refineries have further degraded the cash cow, proving that even the Russian homeland is no longer a sanctuary. Perhaps the most dangerous consequence of this war is the fraying of Russia's internal cohesion. The Russian Federation is an empire in its own right, a patchwork of ethnic republics and vast territories held together by the centralizing force of Moscow. That force is weakening. The war has disproportionately targeted the poor and ethnic minorities from the periphery. It is the Buryats, the Tuvans, and the Dagestanis who are dying in the trenches of the Donbass, while the sons of the Moscow elite party and patriarchy pawns. This blood tax is eroding the social contract. We are seeing the early tremors of separatism. In the Altai region, frustration with authoritarian diktats is bubbling over. In the vast, resource-rich Sakha Republic, local officials are daring to voice dissent against the Kremlin, a phenomenon unthinkable a decade ago. In Ingushetia, the resistance has moved beyond rhetoric. Partisan groups like the Ingush Liberation Army are engaging in kinetic attacks against security forces. These are not isolated incidents. They are stress fractures in a dam that is holding back a deluge. As the central government weakens, stripped of resources and legitimacy, the centrifugal forces of the periphery will accelerate. The nightmare scenario for Putin is not NATO troops in Red Square. It is the chaotic unraveling of Russia itself, a replay of 1991, but with more weapons and less hope. Internationally, Russia is drifting into isolation. The allies that once stood by Moscow are quietly stepping back. Central Asian leaders, sensing the shift in the wind, are diversifying their foreign policies. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are forging new trade routes that bypass Russia, looking to China, Turkey, and even the West. They realize that tying their fate to a sinking ship is bad strategy. Armenia, betrayed by Russian inaction during its conflicts with Azerbaijan, is pivoting away from the CSTO security alliance. Azerbaijan is asserting itself with a confidence that ignores Moscow's preferences. The Russian peacekeeper is now viewed as an oxymoron. The myth of Russian invincibility, painstakingly constructed over 20 years, lies in ruins in the fields of Donetsk. Putin wanted to be remembered as a czar, a gatherer of lands, a peer of Peter the Great. Instead, history will likely record him as the man who, through hubris and strategic blindness, took a flawed but functional nation and drove it off a cliff. He sought to recreate the Soviet Union. He has ended up creating a failed state. The slow-motion collapse is no longer a prediction. It is the daily reality of a nation at war with the world and with itself. The empire isn't returning, it is dying, and its death throes are shaking the foundations of the world. Beyond the geopolitical maps and economic charts lies a simpler, starker reality. Russia is running out of people. The United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense estimates over 1.1 million Russian casualties since the invasion began. This is a staggering number, a demographic wound that will not heal for generations. Every soldier killed or maimed represents a missing father, a lost worker, a vacant chair at a dinner table. In a country that was already facing a demographic crisis before the war, with an aging population and low birth rates, this mass attrition is suicidal. Putin is feeding Russia's future into the furnace of his ambition. The psychological toll on the survivors, returning to a society that has no infrastructure to care for them, will create a legacy of trauma and instability that will plague the country for decades. This is the hidden cost of empire. It is paid not in rubles, but in blood and potential. It is the scientist who fled to Tbilisi to avoid the draft, the engineer who died in a trench in Bakhmut, the child who will grow up without a father. As the walls close in, the danger is that Putin, cornered and desperate, may look for a way to escalate his way out of failure. The rhetoric against NATO is sharpening. The economy is fully mobilized for war. There is a sense of apocalyptic fatalism creeping into the Kremlin's messaging. But escalation cannot fix the fundamental problem. The Russian system is broken. It was built on the personal authority of one man, and that authority has been exposed as a hollow construct. The social contract, stability in exchange for acquiescence, has been shredded. The promise of greatness has been replaced by the reality of isolation. Vladimir Putin presided over the resurrection of Russia's pride, and now he is presiding over its funeral. The zones of interest are shrinking. The great power status is a memory. The empire he dreamed of is rotting in real time. And the tragedy is that he is taking the entire country down with him. The question is no longer whether Russia will win in Ukraine. The question is what will remain of Russia when the losing finally stops.